And how long did the voyage take?
It took about a week, as I recall, and we stopped at Rangoon on the way, and I managed to get ashore and see a little bit of Burma, a little bit of the Shwedagon Pagoda.
And what was that like?
Ah, beautiful. Like a great big chess pawn suspended over the city, you know, glowing gold, gorgeous thing. Yeah, I liked what I saw of Burma. I'm so sorry to see what's happened to that country since. It's just tragic. But they were very buoyant people. I remember being struck by the fact that although they were just as poor as anybody I'd seen in the streets of Calcutta, they were cheerful about it, you know, and they were making a go of it. Whereas in Calcutta they were resigned to their dreadful poverty and sort of sleeping on the streets, abject, you know, sort of wreckage of humanity.
Maybe that was because of the caste system again.
Well, it could have been. The Burmese, I suppose, at least were spared that problem. Yeah, but I'd fallen in love with Burma through the books of Maurice Collis, long before I ever went east again. I loved Maurice Collis, and he was a civil servant in Burma and written marvellous books about Burma. So I wanted to go and explore the interior, but I got distracted in Malaya and subsequently in Hong Kong. I never actually got the chance to go back, and by then the damn military had taken over, this damn junta, and I didn't want to go, you know. It was like going to South Africa during apartheid. But,
and what was Malaya like when you first arrived? What were your first impressions?
Heavenly. I was so happy to be there. Almost a classless society, raceless society, where race didn't seem to matter in those days. You had the majority were Malay, but you had the Chinese following close on their heels, and the Indians, and everybody mingled. There was no visible animosity. It was open door, everybody's home was open to everyone else. It was a fantastic time to be in Malaya. I just lapped it up. I wasn't going to be admitted into the country when the ship arrived at Penang. The immigration officers came aboard and asked my reasons for being there. And I told them I had a job with a newspaper, which wasn't true. They'd never replied to my letter. And they said, which newspaper? And I said, the Malay Mail in Kuala Lumpur. Hasn't the editor written you? I said, bluffing like mad. They said no, they had no record of anyone arriving for a job in the Malay Mail. I said, it must have gone astray in the post or something. Give me a grace time to go and clear it up. Otherwise they were going to give me 2 weeks tourist visa and send me back on the next boat. So they agreed to give me a period to settle the apparent mistake that had been made in not receiving this letter acknowledging my arrival. So I went, my uncle and aunt were there to meet me, of course, and they took me down to KL, and I reported to the Malay Mail and met up with a lovely man called Martin Hutton, who was the editor, and told him my story about how I'd written but never got a reply. And he said yes, he had received a letter and he'd replied saying there wasn't really any vacancy at the time, but you know, if I happened to be in Malaya, maybe I could drop by. And I said, well, frankly, unless you testify to the fact that I've got a job with you, I'm going to be booted out of the country. So he took pity on me and he gave me the letter to say that he was employing me and that the earlier letter must have gone astray. And the first thing I did was to write about my crossing of the Indiaman from London to Calcutta. And it turned into a 3-part television, newspaper serial, and launched my career in Malaya. I loved it.
And so was that piece taken on by Martin Hutton, is that right?
The piece was what?
Was the piece taken on by Martin Hutton?
Yes,
Oh.
yes, he published that. I've still got the cutting somewhere. But then I had a roving assignment. I could do any story I wanted. I travel anywhere in the country I wanted and come back with whatever topic I chose.
And it would be published?
And it would be published. It was marvellous.
And so what kind of
Marvellous
things...
time of my life.
Sorry, what kind of things were you writing about at the time?
Well, I was writing about kelongs in the Malacca Straits, you know, these great big fish traps that were built miles out from shore, run by Chinese usually. And I went with Motti, actually, who was still upstairs sleeping, I think. And we stayed on a kelong for a night, and I wrote about the experience of fishing at night on a kelong. You'd lower this net every hour or so and bring the catch up, and you know, the next morning you take it to market. And then I discovered a little island right off the southwest coast of Johor, populated by sea gypsies, a forgotten people. They were, if Malaya ever had the equivalent of an untouchable race, it would be these people. They were the sort of lowest order of the sea gypsies. They had been pirates in the bad old days, but they were living in abject poverty in this little island off the coast, which was so small. The community was cheek and jowl. Every inch of land was occupied. It was an island with a lighthouse and nothing else, except this community who lived off the sea. They couldn't even have fresh water. They used to row across to the mainland to get their fresh water. But they were very sweet, kindly people. I stayed with them and wrote a story about them. And I used to go into the jungle and visit various Aboriginal tribes and stay with them.
And how was it viewed at that time that you were going to see these kind of various tribes and kind of untouchables?
Well, my aunt and uncle viewed it with horror, of course, because they lived in their little balloon of military life, a little military world in Kuala Lumpur. But they acknowledged the fact that I was making a reputation for myself. I wrote everything. I wrote about remote, forgotten lakes, and the more outbeat, off the beaten track it was, the better for me. I went on the inaugural train journey from Johor to Kota Baru. They just opened the line again. The Japanese had stolen most of the rails during the war, and they had this train service re-established called the Golden Blowpipe. And they gave me a seat in a first-class compartment to myself, and I travelled with the Malay regiment who were based up on the coast there. Lovely people. The Malay police field force, that's right. And they made me at home in their little community on the coast. I took my scooter in the baggage car, and it was the first scooter ever seen in Kota Baru, and it attracted enormous attention everywhere I went. Yeah, lovely years. I went to Langkawi when there was absolutely nothing there. You'd have to wade ashore from the once-a-day ferry from Kuala Lumpur, I think, or what am I thinking of? Alostar was the capital, but it was from the port from Alostar, really, this ferry started. Yes, it took 6 hours to cross the sea to Langkawi. Arrived after dark, and we waded ashore across Beche de Mer, which squished underfoot. And the only place to stay was the sanatorium with 4 bedrooms, a sort of atap thatch affair on a headland. And there were no other people staying there. And I had room number 4 because the other 3 rooms had been booked by a circuit judge and his party who never arrived. That very evening that I arrived, everybody of any consequence in Langkawi visited to see who were the newcomers that they could talk to in their insular environment, you know. And they found me, and at some point in the conversation they would invariably ask which room was I in, and I'd say room number 4, and there'd be a pause in the conversation, and they'd say, "Are you sure? I mean, you know about the story of room number 4, don't you?" And I'd say, "Yes, because I'd heard it from the previous guy." And they'd all repeat the same story about some Malay police constable who'd been found in possession of a grenade by the Japanese and flogged for not admitting how he came to possess it until he died and they threw his body in the sea. And apparently he'd been strapped in the doorway of this room, spread eagles, in order to be flogged. So of course there I was. I thought to myself, these bastards, they've got together and conspired. They do this every time there's a visitor. Whichever room he happens to be in, if he's on his own, they'll tell him that room is haunted. So I thought, I'm not going to play their stupid games. I'm not going to go to the caretaker and ask to be put in one of the other rooms, which had already been reserved anyway. So I'll stick it out and defy them. I couldn't sleep a wink. It was awful. Huge room, vast, all wood creaking, wood shrinking at night, cracking, groaning, you know, like being on board a ship at sea. And all the lights went out at 10 o'clock because the motorized generator got off at 10. So you had this flickering oil lamp by your bed, which was casting inflated shadows all over the ceiling, and bats were flying through the room, and turkeys were gobbling under the floorboards, and I'd extinguished the lamp because it was making such horrifying shadows, and then I'd frantically relight it again because I could hear something crawling across the floor. And at one point I sat bolt upright in bed thinking I actually saw the outlines of this body spread eagle in the doorway. And I stared and stared at it, half of me accepting it and half of me refusing to do so, until the sounder half prevailed and I realized it was a figment of my imagination. And after that I slept very soundly. But at least I could tell them in the morning that I had managed to I'd stick it out in room number 4 and nothing had happened to me. If there is anything out there, anything extrasensory, I am incapable of perceiving it. I have written so many ghost stories. I was once invited by the French ambassador in Kuala Lumpur to write about the ghost in his chancery. He just renovated at tremendous expense a beautiful old mansion that had been owned by a Chinese merchant before the war, but which had acquired a terrible reputation after the war because the man had disappeared, supposedly the victim of Japanese brutality. All the ghost stories seem to stem from World War II. And nobody would buy this property until the French ambassador chanced upon it. It was an absolute bargain, a beautiful building. So he renovated it at considerable expense. And naturally I rang up to ask circuitously how he liked the new embassy. I was hoping he'd tell me the story. And he said, "Oh, it's great, but it's haunted, you know, of course. Do come round and I'll tell you all about it." So with alacrity I rushed round and sat in his beautifully oak-lined office, which had just been done up. And he started out telling me the story of how he'd discovered this and how he'd realized it was a bargain. And there was a rapping on the woodwork behind my chair. And he paused and he said, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What do you think it is?" And I said, "I think it's somebody trying to get in." He said, "But there is no door there." So of course I looked around, and sure enough there wasn't a door. And I said, "Apparently not, but do continue." So he haltingly continued, and there was more aggressive rapping, followed by a section of the panelling sliding open, and into the room materialized this apparition in a white bedsheet with a couple of holes cut for its eyes, dragging a lavatory ball cock and chain. It's all I could do to keep a straight face. This thing shambled its way across the room to release itself from the door, the ordinary door, and then forgot the ball cock and chain, so had to open the door and whisk the ball cock and chain. Well, I stared solemnly at the French ambassador, who realized that I had not been fooled. But then he apologized for this little joke that the third consul or whatever had decided to play on the very first person who wanted to know about the ghost. But then he invited me to speak to the first secretary, who told me a really scary story about, which I totally believed, and he let me publish it, about the real ghost. He had chosen to live in the premises, occupying the sole apartment at the back. And on his first night, he'd been aroused by a scraping at the window pane by his bed. And in the moonlight, he'd seen this blood-streaked face and fingernails leaving little trails of blood down the glass. Well, he was shocked rigid, put the light on, the apparition slowly faded, and he decided the only way to deal with this was to empathize with the victim of whoever had suffered that dreadful torture. And he did, and it kind of established an empathetic mental bond which spared him any further intrusion. But his wife was due from Paris, and he hoped that she wouldn't experience anything herself, and he wouldn't bother to tell her because it would scare her. So he didn't say anything, and she was sharing the room with him, and she was in an adjoining bed, twin beds with a bedside table between them. And she woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and he put the light on, and she was staring down at the space between their beds, and he calmed her down, and finally she said that she'd been looking at this man crawling across the floor on his hands and knees, looking dreadful, very, very much in pain, with a blood-stained face. Everything tallied with the vision he'd seen. So then he told her about his experience, and he reasoned with her and said, "Look, do what I did. Just feel sorry for him. That's all he wants is our pity and our understanding and our sympathy." And she calmed down, and that's what she agreed she would do. And they never got disturbed again. Except one night when they were watching television, and the French windows, being a French embassy, of course it would have to have French windows, one of the doors opened from the veranda on a calm night, nothing, no window to account for it. It was normally latched. And the dog, which had been lying by them, by the television set, got up with its hackles raised and, growled its way over the floor to the door and sniffed, and then started wagging its tail. And they realized that the dog had accepted this presence as well. So there we were. So I've written about ghost stories like this, and I just wish I could actually experience something like it myself, but I never have.
So the Second World War had obviously really had quite a large mark on the colony.
Absolutely. And Malaya was abound with stories of ghosts. Almost everywhere I went, people could tell me either first-hand or second-hand experiences. The Japanese had left a dreadful reputation behind for cruelty,
Yeah.
Yeah, but they were marvellous days. I had a wonderful 8 years there. I went and covered the last... the emergency was declared over officially in 1960. And it had been the longest war that the West had ever won against communism up to that point. It had succeeded because Malaya was a peninsula where any traffic in and out was carefully governed. So the terrorists weren't getting supplies from overseas. And being mainly Chinese, led by Jinping, they could only depend on sympathizers among their own community. But General Templar had exercised this closed village policy where all the Chinese, the rural Chinese, were kept behind barbed wire in what were effectively prison encampments at night, and only allowed out with passes during the day to work. And they were inspected to make sure they weren't carrying any food that could supply the terrorists. So the terrorists were being starved of their supplies and losing strength and losing numbers. And the counter-propaganda campaign was being very successful. Leaflets were being dropped over the jungle, and they were surrendering in large numbers. So I was only there for the last 3 years of the emergency. And when it was declared officially over, I knew that it couldn't be that simple. There must be a residue of it up on the border with Thailand. So I went to talk to Sir Robert Thompson, who was the Secretary for Defence. He subsequently went to Vietnam and became the American advisor on closed villages in Vietnam. Of course, they didn't work in Vietnam because Vietnam had that spine with Cambodia, you know, and it was, you couldn't police the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Anyway, Thompson was very decent. He agreed to give me passes that would get me to visit all of the military units still operating on the border. And I spent, I think, a week visiting different units: Australian Regiment, British Artillery Regiment. Even went over the border into South Thailand to cover the operations of the police military field force, who, being only a quasi-military force, were allowed to operate in Thailand. The Thais didn't want the Malaysian military in their midst. Of course, it was still Malaya then, before Malaysia was formed. Anyway, I had a great time reporting on, going out on patrol, and flying on reconnaissance missions to see if we could spot any guerrilla camps. Earlier I had persuaded the Kuala Lumpur Flying Club to let me go up on their pay drops. During the emergency, a lot of the roads became unsafe because of ambushes. So the big tin mines and rubber estates had arranged with the Flying Club to deliver the workers' wages by air. And the Flying Club were using a battered old de Havilland Tiger Moth, open cockpit Tiger Moth. And I loved flying. I mean, I'd been weaned on Biggles books, and I'd hung around the airfield at Hastings to catch lifts in whatever aircraft happened to be coming through. So it was a delight for me to sit in the back seat of this Tiger Moth with anything up to $100,000 worth of wages on my lap in sacks, you know, 2 or 3 sacks. And I would drop these when we flew very low over the football pitch, usually, of whatever rubber estate or tin mine we were delivering to. And there'd be a white cross about 4 feet in either direction as a marker. and the trick was to land the bag as close as possible to this cross. The pilot was very geared up for this, and he'd say, when I put my arm out, you put the bag out, but don't drop it. When I drop my arm, you drop the bag. And he'd calculated the travelling distance, because as a bomber, you release your bombs before you're over the target, because the bombs are travelling at the same speed as you are. And we were pretty good, we were pretty spot on. Except on one occasion, the ground was very hard in this old tin mine, and the bag I dropped burst. All these banknotes were flying in every direction, and villagers were scurrying and saying, God, it wasn't my fault, I didn't unstitch it. That was great, yeah.
What about Malayan culture? What was that like at that time?
I loved outstation Malaya. I loved the Chinese townships and their vigour and bustle, and the fact that you could sit in a lovely old Chinese coffee shop and drink their thick black treacly coffee, which was so strong you could almost stand a teaspoon in it. And I loved their gregarious community life, their vitality. Complete contrast to the Malays, of course, who would live in kampongs with lots of space between themselves and the next house, because they were gardeners and they loved big gardens. But I met Motti at a fairly early stage, and the agreement was that he would teach me Malay if I would teach him English. So he took me to his kampong, which was halfway between Kuala Lumpur and Kuala Selangor, and introduced me to the family, and I liked the Malay lifestyle. Conrad had liked it too, you know, and Hugh Clifford, who was another of my literary idols, had totally accepted Malay culture and had worn a sarong most of his life, even as governor of Singapore. So I felt in my element, you know, I was learning Malay, I was in the midst of this Malay community, and thoroughly at home. And then one day Motti disappeared from the scene and wasn't to be found. And I went and found his colleagues who were at his workplace, who told me he was desperately ill and dying, and that his family had taken him back to the kampong to die. I said, God, you can't, you know, I mean, he was only the same age as me, it was ridiculous. So I drove back to the kampong and found a funeral wake in progress, almost, you know, the sort of the last hours had come. The Burma was mumbo-jumboing over this shriveled wreck of a body. He was so shrunken, it was like a bag of bones, a sack of bones. And I said, what the hell's going on, you know? They had actually removed him from hospital. They kidnapped him because they didn't trust Western medicine. He was getting perfectly good treatment in Kuala Lumpur General Hospital. So I said, I'm not having this. I picked him up, he was light as a feather, and I carried him back to the car with the entire village trailing after me.
Was there any kind of opposition to you doing that?
Well, no, because they were surrendering him. He was about to die as they saw it. So what could be worse, you know? Okay, if I could offer any help. His father came along and said, yes, please, you know, take him back, and I did. And we got him back to health in no time. He was fine. It was a kidney infection, but because it wasn't getting treated, it was, you know, his blood supply was getting poisoned. So at that point, his father said to me, you've been so good to my son, please, please take him in your care and look after him. So that was back in 1960, and that was what, nearly 50 years ago. And yes, his father's died, but he's still with me. He's upstairs at the moment, recovering from his own last spell in hospital.